In the early morning darkness of July 13th, 1941, at precisely 2:43 a.m., a young woman named André de Jong, just 25 years old, found herself crouched behind a massive boulder high in the Pyrenees Mountains at an elevation of 11,000 feet. She was watching intently as German border patrol flashlights cut through the darkness, systematically sweeping across the trail some 200 yards below her position. The gravity of the situation was clear. If those searching beams discovered her and the 3 shivering British pilots huddled beside her in the freezing mountain air, all of them would face execution by firing squad before the sun rose. Consider the absurdity of the situation. Here was a nursing student on her very first mountain crossing, someone with absolutely zero training for this kind of operation. Beside her, cowered 3 completely exhausted airmen who had already survived the trauma of being shot down over France, only to discover that their supposed evacuation route demanded they climb through pitch-black, freezing conditions, wearing nothing but thin-soled shoes, all while Nazi patrols actively hunted them through the mountains. What would unfold in the next 47 minutes would demonstrate something remarkable. This Belgian girl, barely 5 feet tall, was about to prove that the most lethal weapon operating anywhere in occupied Europe wasn't firearms, wasn't secret codes, and it certainly wasn't explosives. The deadliest weapon turned out to be her ability to appear so diminutive, so youthful, and so unmistakably female that every German soldier would simply look right through her, never suspecting that she was simultaneously constructing an escape network that would ultimately rescue 776 lives. Down below, the flashlight beam continued its methodical approach, getting closer with each sweep. This was clearly a systematic search pattern. German border guards hunting for smugglers and anyone connected to the resistance movement. Flight Lieutenant Robert Henderson, a 26-year-old pilot who had been shot down over Lille just 3 weeks earlier, trembled uncontrollably beside her. His shaking wasn't caused by the mountain cold. It was pure, undiluted terror coursing through him. This was a man who had survived an incredible 42 combat missions over Germany, who had lived through his Spitfire literally exploding around him at 18,000 feet. Yet hiding behind this boulder while German lights searched for him had become the single most terrifying moment of his entire war. André leaned close and whispered just 3 simple words to him. "They won't see us." The confidence in her voice came from careful preparation. She had spent 6 full weeks studying these patrol patterns in meticulous detail. She knew with precision exactly when the guards would sweep through this particular section of the mountains. They had exactly 4 minutes to wait until the patrol would pass by. As long as everyone remained absolutely silent and perfectly still, the patrol would completely miss their hiding spot and move on. The stakes couldn't have been higher. If they were discovered, Henderson and his 2 fellow pilots would be immediately executed as spies. There would be no trial, no possibility of a prisoner exchange. This was established German policy for any Allied personnel who were caught wearing civilian clothes behind enemy lines. They'd be shot at dawn without hesitation. For André, the consequences would be even more horrific. The Gestapo had made it clear they wanted Dedée, her code name, captured alive. They'd offered a reward of 25,000 francs for information leading to her capture. If caught, she would endure days of torture as they extracted every detail about the network's operations before her public execution. They'd shoot her by firing squad in Brussels, then display her body as a warning to others who might consider resistance. The patrol lights swept even closer now, coming within 50 yards of their position. The beams illuminated rocks, tree trunks, and stretches of empty trail. Henderson held his breath until his lungs burned. The two other pilots pressed themselves flat against the cold stone surface, trying to become invisible. Andre, however, didn't move a muscle. She didn't even allow her breathing to become louder. She simply watched the scene unfold with what appeared to be absolute, unshakable calm. Eventually, the patrol continued moving on. Their voices gradually faded into the distance. The searching lights disappeared as they headed down toward the valley below. At 2:51 a.m., Andre stood up smoothly and gestured forward with a simple hand motion. They climbed higher, moving away from the patrol routes, heading toward Spain, and eventually toward the British consulate in Bilbao, where absolutely nobody would believe what this tiny Belgian nurse had just accomplished. 3 days after that harrowing mountain crossing, Michael Creswell sat in his office at the Bilbao consulate, expecting to interview what he assumed would be a middle-aged man, probably someone with a military background, definitely someone who actually looked physically capable of crossing the Pyrenees. Then at exactly 9:37 on the morning of August 15th, Andre de Jong walked through his door. She stood barely 5 feet tall, weighed perhaps 100 pounds, had dark hair that was disheveled from travel, wore clothing that had seen better days, and her boots were caked with dried mud. To Creswell's eyes, she looked like nothing more than an exhausted teenager who'd been on the road too long. Behind her came 3 RAF pilots, all unshaven and filthy from their ordeal. Henderson was among them, his shoulder visibly bandaged. All 3 looked like men who had somehow survived hell itself. Creswell could only stare in disbelief. This was Dedée, this young girl standing before him. Without ceremony, Andre dropped 3 British identity tags onto his desk with a metallic clink. "Quote 1, she said matter-of-factly. Quote 2, Ansu. Andre-Marie Léonie de Jong had entered the world on January 30th, 1916, in Schaerbeek, Belgium. Throughout her childhood, her father filled her imagination with stories about Edith Cavell, the British nurse who had been executed back in 1915 for the crime of helping Allied soldiers escape from occupied territory. When German forces invaded Belgium in May of 1940, Andre was just 24 years old. Almost immediately, she began hiding British soldiers in her home, providing them with civilian clothing and forged identity papers. By August of 1940, she had successfully helped 15 soldiers reach France. However, she quickly recognized that the operation was inefficient and disorganized. What the network desperately needed was proper structure and organization. By the early months of 1941, she had established a network of safe houses scattered across Belgium, reliable guides who could take people to the French border, and contacts within France who could continue the journey towards Spain. But there was a critical problem. The route came to a dead end at the Pyrenees Mountains. Professional smugglers controlled all the mountain crossings, charged absolutely exorbitant fees, and worked as informants for the Gestapo at least half the time. The crossing itself was deadly enough on its own. It required traveling 26 kilometers through treacherous mountains during nighttime hours. Travelers faced freezing temperatures, constant patrols from both German and Spanish border guards, and the debilitating effects of altitude sickness. Then Andre discovered something that professional smugglers and military planners had somehow never figured out. It was something so absurdly simple that it seemed impossible that nobody had thought of it before. It was something that would ultimately save 776 lives. The secret was this. She looked completely harmless. That was literally it. The entire trick that made everything work. A 5-foot-tall woman with worn-out shoes and tired eyes, walking through Nazi checkpoints, simply didn't register in their minds as any kind of threat. When German soldiers looked at her, their training told them that women aren't dangerous operatives. Their Nazi ideology reinforced the belief that women can't possibly run military operations. Their personal experience told them that resistance leaders are always men. They expected former soldiers, experienced operatives, people who actually looked capable of committing violence. Instead, Andrée looked like nothing more than a tired young girl who happened to be traveling with her brothers, or perhaps her cousins, or maybe her boyfriend. German border guards would check her papers, glance briefly at her face, then focus their attention on checking the men's papers more carefully, and then wave the entire group through. None of them ever suspected that this 90-pound nurse was actually the operational commander, successfully moving Allied pilots through some of the most heavily surveilled territory in all of occupied Europe. Professional smugglers had always tried to remain inconspicuous by hiding from view, moving only during nighttime hours, and avoiding patrol routes entirely. Andrée's approach was the complete opposite. She walked directly through checkpoints in broad daylight, smiled pleasantly at German soldiers, and acted like she belonged there, like she had every legitimate right to be traveling with 3 nervous men who could barely speak a word of French. Her approach worked every single time without fail, because nobody could imagine that Dedée, the mysterious network leader the Gestapo was hunting with a massive 100,000 franc reward, was actually a 90-pound nurse who looked utterly incapable of hurting anyone. That natural camouflage became the absolute foundation of the Comet Line's operations. Every decision they made, every route they chose, every procedure they followed, all of it was designed around one central principle. Look so harmless that Germans wouldn't recognize the threat standing directly in front of them. She understood she needed someone who really knew the mountains. That's when she found Florentino Goicoechea, a Basque smuggler who had been crossing the Pyrenees his entire life. His own brother had been executed by Franco's forces during the Spanish Civil War. When Andrée explained the mission to him, he agreed to help immediately. But he had one firm condition. He would only work with her specifically, because she was small, light, fast, and most importantly, she wouldn't slow him down on the treacherous mountain trails. They tested the complete route in July of 1941. The journey went from Brussels to Paris by train, then from Paris to Bayonne, then from Bayonne to Saint-Jean-de-Luz. From there came the challenging part, 26 kilometers through the Pyrenees during nighttime hours. After 14 brutal hours of climbing, they finally reached Spain at dawn on July 13th. Andrée took the pilot to the British consulate in Bilbao to complete the mission. The diplomats actually laughed in her face when she explained what she'd done. To them, she was just another delusional amateur, another civilian who thought resistance work was romantic and exciting. In their experience, resistance networks typically lasted only a few weeks before the Gestapo rolled them up completely. This tiny girl was claiming she'd crossed the Pyrenees and claiming she could repeat this feat on a weekly basis. To them, it was impossible. One diplomat told her directly and dismissively. Andrée looked at him steadily. She said calmly. Then she simply walked back to Brussels to continue her work. By August of 1941, the network had acquired a name, the Comet Line. It was organized into small cells that were compartmentalized for security. If one cell was compromised and fell, the others could survive and continue operating. They established safe houses scattered across Belgium and France. Their forged identity papers were perfect enough to fool even German document experts. They had railway workers who would buy tickets for them. Most importantly, they had ordinary citizens who were risking execution on a daily basis to save Allied airmen they would never actually meet. André personally escorted most of the groups herself. She would travel from Brussels to Paris by train, then from Paris to Bayonne, then from Bayonne over the Pyrenees. She completed the full journey every single time. She refused to trust the pilots to guides she hadn't personally vetted and approved. Each crossing took 4 to 5 days to complete, sometimes even longer when German patrols were particularly heavy in the area. Every single checkpoint was like playing Russian roulette with their lives. German soldiers would examine their papers carefully. One wrong answer, one nervous gesture, and everyone would die on the spot. André walked through dozens upon dozens of checkpoints, her heart pounding hard in her chest, while maintaining a perfectly calm expression on her face. She traveled under various covers as the pilot's sister, cousin, girlfriend, whatever cover story fit the situation best. Germans would see a small Belgian woman and rarely suspected anything was amiss. The camouflage of appearing harmless saved their lives every single time. Exactly 3 weeks after the diplomats had laughed at her proposal, André returned to Bilbao with 3 more pilots in tow. 4 weeks after that, she brought 3 more. By October of 1941, she had personally delivered 12 Allied personnel to safety. The British officials stopped laughing at her. MI9 approved funding for her operations. Michael Creswell filed a revised report that stated, quote 6. By December of 1941, André had personally escorted 24 pilots to freedom. In just 3 months, she had saved 24 lives. The diplomat who had told her to return to nursing sent an official apology through MI9 channels. Over the course of 17 months, André crossed the Pyrenees a staggering 33 times. She personally escorted 118 Allied personnel to safety. That's 118 men who survived the war, because a 5-foot-tall Belgian nurse walked them through Nazi checkpoints and over mountains in the dead of night. The physical toll absolutely destroyed her body. Blisters became infected and never properly healed. Muscles tore from the constant strain. Frostbite permanently damaged the nerves in her feet. She would walk with a noticeable limp for the rest of her life. But despite all of this, she kept going. Every week she made the journey, sometimes even twice a week. More pilots, more crossings, more lives saved. The network grew at an explosive rate. By late 1941, they had over 800 helpers scattered across Belgium and France. They had safe houses everywhere you could imagine. They had forgers creating papers that were perfect enough to fool German document experts. They had doctors treating injured pilots. They had the railway workers and ordinary citizens who were risking execution on a daily basis to save airmen they would never personally meet. The Gestapo knew something significant was happening. Allied pilots were somehow disappearing from occupied territory. They weren't showing up in prison camps. They were just gone without a trace. German counterintelligence investigated the matter aggressively, offering absolutely massive rewards for information. They offered 25,000 francs for network details. They raised it to 50,000 francs for Dedée's location. They offered 100,000 francs for her capture alive. They tortured resistance members brutally, making public examples of them to intimidate others. The betrayals began to mount steadily. Safe houses were raided without warning. Pilots were captured. Belgian helpers were shot in the streets without any trial whatsoever. The Gestapo found documents with names and addresses, and they started rolling up the network in a methodical fashion. André restructured everything immediately. She closed every compromised safe house. They changed their routes completely. They created new papers with new names. She warned everyone in the network. The network barely survived, but it did survive. The losses continued mounting throughout 1942. In April, 6 network members were arrested in Paris. All of them were executed within a week. In June, a guide was caught at the Spanish border, tortured for days until he broke and gave up names. This led to 8 more arrests and 5 more executions. The Gestapo was steadily closing in on them. They knew by now that the network was run by someone codenamed Dedée. They knew she was Belgian. They knew she personally crossed the Pyrenees on these operations. They kept offering escalating rewards, enough money to make anyone wealthy for life, enough to tempt desperate people into betrayal. In November of 1942, they caught her father during a routine document check. Frederick had been caught with forged papers for 3 American pilots. They took him to Saint-Gilles prison and interrogated him for weeks. They tortured him brutally, trying to make him reveal the network's structure, trying to make him give up Dedée's identity and location. He told them absolutely nothing of value. Every torture session ended the same way. He insisted he worked alone, that there was no network, that it didn't exist. He died in prison in March of 1943. The official cause of death was listed as pneumonia. The reality was that he had been tortured to death. André desperately wanted to rescue him. Her MI9 contacts absolutely forbade it. They told her the Gestapo was waiting for exactly that. She would be captured within hours of attempting a rescue. She didn't go back, because hundreds of pilots still needed the network to remain functional. Personal grief couldn't be allowed to stop operations from continuing. The betrayal that ultimately caught her came from within the network itself. A Belgian collaborator named Jacques Desubry had infiltrated the network in late 1942. He posed as a resistance sympathizer, gaining trust slowly and carefully, learning their routes, identifying key personnel, playing the long game with patience. He was actually working for the Abwehr, German military intelligence, and he was specifically targeting the Comet line for destruction. The Germans knew that Dedée was the operational leader. They knew that catching her would collapse the entire network like a house of cards. Desubry spent months carefully building his cover. He actually helped pilots escape. He provided safe houses. He acted like a dedicated, passionate resistance member. He gained André's trust step by careful step. He was patient, professional, and represented exactly the kind of infiltration that destroyed resistance networks from the inside. On January 15, 1943, André was escorting 3 American pilots from Bayonne to the Spanish border. This was a standard operation for her. She had done it dozens of times before. Same route, same procedures, same mountain crossing with Florentino as her guide. Desubry was part of the escort group that night, traveling with them and acting as a backup guide. André had absolutely no reason to suspect him of anything. He had been helping the network for months without incident. They reached a farmhouse near Urugne, just 3 kilometers from the Spanish border. This was their staging point. where pilots would rest before the mountain crossing, change into appropriate hiking clothes, eat a final meal, and prepare themselves mentally for the brutal 14-hour trek ahead. André, the 3 American pilots, Florentino and Dedée, all arrived at the farmhouse at 9 p.m. The plan was straightforward and simple. Depart at midnight, cross the mountains under cover of darkness, and reach Spain by dawn. This was supposed to be just another routine operation, number 33 for André. At 11:15 p.m., German soldiers surrounded the farmhouse completely. There were Wehrmacht troops and Gestapo officers, 20 men in total, all heavily armed, all positioned strategically to prevent any possibility of escape. They had known exactly where to go. They knew exactly when to arrive. They knew exactly how many people would be inside the building. The Germans kicked in the door violently and flooded into the building with their weapons raised. They arrested everyone within seconds. André, the 3 Americans, Florentino, all were captured. Dedée wasn't arrested at all. He walked out with the Germans like he belonged with them, because he did belong with them. His infiltration mission was complete. The network was compromised. Dedée was captured. His promotion and payment were waiting for him. The Gestapo transported André to Bayonne immediately and started her interrogation within the hour. They wanted absolutely everything from her: names of network members, the complete network structure, locations of all safe houses, British contacts in Spain, funding sources, communication methods, the entire operational architecture of the Comet line. André told them nothing that was actually useful. She said she was just a simple courier who followed orders. She claimed she didn't know who the network leadership was. She said she'd never met anyone important in the organization. She insisted she just did what she was told by people she'd never actually seen. It was a convincing lie coming from someone who actually ran the entire operation herself. The interrogators didn't believe her story for a second. They knew exactly who she was. They had Dedée's intelligence reports. They had surveillance documentation. They had proof that she was the operational center of everything. The Gestapo interrogation report from January 16, 1943 described her this way. Subject maintains her cover story, despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. She claims to be nothing more than a low-level courier. Her physical appearance actually supports this claim. She appears utterly incapable of organizational leadership. However, our intelligence clearly indicates that the subject is the primary operational commander. They tortured her continuously for 3 days straight. They beat her. They deprived her of sleep. There were other things she never talked about afterward. The worst things. They tried to break her will, using the same methods they'd used to break her father. Same techniques, same brutality, same absolute determination to extract useful information from her. The report from January 18th noted she told them absolutely nothing accurate or useful. Instead, she gave them false information that sounded plausible enough. She gave them safe house addresses that had already been abandoned. She provided names of people who didn't actually exist. She described routes that weren't being used anymore. She led them to Brussels addresses that were completely empty. She gave them contact names that went absolutely nowhere. Every lie she told saved lives somewhere in the network. Every bit of misdirection bought precious time for the network to adapt and reorganize. Every hour she held out was another hour for safe houses to close down, for personnel to disappear, for pilots to reach Spain through different routes that remained uncompromised. The final interrogation report from January 20th stated, "Badiabar quote Jatnain." After 3 days of brutal interrogation, The Gestapo finally gave up on extracting information. They realized she simply wouldn't break, no matter what they did to her. They decided she was more valuable as an example than as an intelligence source. They would work her to death in a concentration camp. They would show Belgian and French resistance members what happened to people who helped Allied pilots escape, but the execution never actually happened as planned. German bureaucracy intervened in an unexpected way. There was paperwork to process and jurisdictional disputes to resolve. The Abwehr wanted credit for capturing Dedée. The Gestapo wanted to maintain control of her case. The Wehrmacht wanted to interrogate her about Allied bomber tactics and procedures. While various German agencies argued over paperwork and jurisdiction, André was transferred to Fresnes prison in Paris, where she spent 3 months in solitary confinement. In May of 1943, they finally sent her to Ravensbrück, the notorious women's concentration camp, effectively a death sentence. She arrived there in June of 1943. She was assigned prisoner number 27,149 and weighed just 93 pounds. The camp doctors made notes that she wouldn't survive more than 6 months under these conditions. The conditions in the camp were deliberately designed to kill prisoners slowly. There were 20 prisoners, crammed into barracks that had been built for 8 people. They worked 16-hour shifts, doing back-breaking labor. They received only 600 calories of food daily. There were random beatings, summary executions, and medical experiments conducted without any anesthesia whatsoever. She survived by focusing on one single goal: outlive the Nazis, get home somehow, and restart the network. In March of 1944, they transferred her to Mauthausen camp in Austria, which was even worse than Ravensbrück. There was a stone quarry where prisoners were forced to carry heavy granite blocks up 186 stairs. They worked 14 hours every single day. If you fell, you were shot immediately. If you couldn't work anymore, you were executed. She carried granite blocks for 8 solid months. While her body was systematically destroyed, her weight dropped to just 80 pounds. The camp doctors noted in their records that she was unlikely to survive past September. But she survived through sheer willpower. She survived through friendships with other prisoners. She survived through absolute determination to outlive the people who had killed her father. The Soviet Army liberated Mauthausen on May 5, 1945. After 2 full years in concentration camps, after starvation, torture, and forced labor, she weighed just 78 pounds. She could barely walk. Her feet were permanently damaged. Her health was destroyed in ways that would never fully heal. But she was alive. The Nazis hadn't broken her spirit. They hadn't made her betray any network members. They hadn't destroyed her will to survive. She was evacuated to Britain and hospitalized for 3 months while they treated her for severe malnutrition, multiple infections, and deep psychological trauma. The doctors told her that her survival was miraculous. They said she shouldn't have lived through Ravensbrück alone. They said that surviving both Ravensbrück and Mauthausen was statistically impossible. It simply didn't happen. André didn't care about their statistics at all. What she cared about was what had happened to the network while she was imprisoned. She wanted to know whether the Comet line had survived. She wanted to know how many pilots they'd evacuated. She needed to know whether all her work had actually mattered in the end. MI9 gave her the numbers she'd been hoping for. The Comet line had continued operating even after her capture. Other members had stepped up and taken over leadership. The network had evolved, adapted, and survived despite intense Gestapo pressure. Between August of 1941 and May of 1945, the Comet line successfully evacuated 776 Allied personnel to safety. These included British pilots, American pilots, Allied soldiers, and Special Operations personnel. That's 776 men who returned to Britain because Belgian and French civilians had risked absolutely everything to help them escape. André had personally escorted 118 of those 776 people, more than any other single guide, more than any other network leader in the entire organization. But the cost had been absolutely devastating. Over 800 people had worked for the Comet line at various points during the war. Of those, 157 were executed by the Germans. Another 73 died in concentration camps. Hundreds more were imprisoned and tortured, and many of them never fully recovered from what was done to them. André's own father, Frederick, had died in Saint-Gilles prison after being tortured. Her sister had been arrested but fortunately survived. Dozens of her closest friends and colleagues had been executed or died in the camps. The network had saved 776 lives, but it had cost 230 Belgian and French lives to achieve that success. Every single pilot who was evacuated represented multiple resistance workers who had risked execution to move that pilot one step closer to freedom. After the war ended, André chose distance over recognition. She went back to nursing, but not in Belgium. There were too many painful memories there. Instead, she joined a missionary organization working in Africa. She worked in leprosy hospitals, spending 35 years treating patients that everyone else had abandoned. She rarely spoke about the war. When people asked about her limp, she would simply say it was an old injury. She didn't mention the Pyrenees. She didn't mention the concentration camps. She didn't mention being Dedée at all. Recognition came anyway, whether she wanted it or not. She received Belgium's highest honors. France awarded her the Legion of Honor. Britain gave her the George Medal. America presented her with the Medal of Freedom. She attended the ceremonies purely out of obligation. She accepted the medals politely, thanked people graciously, and then returned to her quiet life, helping others. When journalists asked her about what had motivated her during the war, she always gave the same answer. She had been inspired by Edith Cavell's example. She had tried to live up to Cavell's standard of helping others without hatred and without bitterness. She was just doing what needed to be done. Florentino Goicoechea survived the war as well. He continued smuggling operations even after André's capture. He made over 80 crossings of the Pyrenees and evacuated hundreds more people. Multiple governments honored him for his service, except Spain. Franco viewed him as a criminal and never officially acknowledged what he had done to help the Allied cause. Florentino died in 1980 at the age of 87. He and André remained close friends until his death. They wrote letters regularly. They visited occasionally. They remembered the mountain crossings together. They remembered all the pilots they'd saved. Jacques Desoubry, the Belgian collaborator who had betrayed André to the Germans, was tried for treason after the war ended. He was convicted of collaboration and of causing multiple resistance deaths through his intelligence work for the Abwehr. He was executed by firing squad in Brussels in 1947. Before his execution, journalists asked him why he had betrayed his own country. They asked why he had specifically targeted the Comet line for destruction. His answer was chilling. He said he had believed Germany would win the war. He had wanted to be on the winning side when it was all over. He stated he had no regrets, except for getting caught. The 3 American pilots, Lieutenants Johnson, Grimes, and more, survived their time as prisoners of war. They were liberated in April of 1945. All three immediately tried to find André to thank her properly. They finally located her in 1947 while she was working in Africa. They wrote her letters. They offered to visit her. She politely declined their offers. She preferred to move forward with her life rather than revisit the past. But those three men never forgot her, not for a single day. All three of them named their daughters after her. All three kept her photograph until the day they died. André Marie Léonie de Jong died on October 13th, 2007, at the age of 90. Her funeral in Brussels was attended by thousands of people. There were government officials, diplomats, veterans, and former pilots. People lined the streets to pay their respects. The Belgian government offered her a state funeral with full honors, but she had specifically requested against it in her will. She wanted a simple ceremony with no excessive military honors, just a quiet acknowledgement of her life. Remarkably, her obituary focused primarily on her post-war work in Africa. It talked about the leprosy patients she'd treated and her humanitarian service over 35 years. Her wartime activities received exactly 2 sentences. During World War II, de Jong founded the Comet line and personally evacuated 118 Allied personnel before being captured and sent to concentration camps. Just 2 sentences for saving 118 lives. 2 sentences for building a network that evacuated 776 people. 2 sentences for surviving 2 different concentration camps. 2 sentences for crossing the Pyrenees 33 times while being hunted by the Gestapo. But the pilots she saved remembered her, and that mattered more than any obituary. Those 776 men she helped save went on to have families of their own. Their children grew up. Those children had children. Then those grandchildren had children. Today, there are thousands of people alive because André de Jong refused to accept that young women couldn't run escape networks. She refused to accept that the Pyrenees were too dangerous to cross repeatedly. She refused to give the Gestapo any information that could compromise her network, even when they tortured her for days on end. She refused to die in concentration camps when the Nazis tried to work her to death through forced labor. All those thousands of descendants carry her legacy forward into the future. Not through medals or monuments or history books that barely mention her name. They carry her legacy through their very existence, through their families, through the simple fact that they're alive today, because one 5-foot-tall Belgian nurse looked at the Nazi occupation and decided she would do something about it instead of waiting passively for someone else to act. The British consulate building in Bilbao, where André delivered her first 3 pilots back in August of 1941, now has a small plaque. It was installed in 2011 and reads, "In memory of André de Jong and the Comet line. 776 Allied personnel evacuated. 157 Belgian and French resistance members executed. They saved lives while others watched." That plaque is more accurate than any official recognition André received during her lifetime because it acknowledges the full cost of what was accomplished. It remembers the 157 people who were executed by firing squad. It remembers the 73 who died in the camps. It remembers the hundreds who were imprisoned and tortured. It remembers all the network members who paid with their very lives so that Allied pilots could escape and fly again. André never wanted glory for what she'd done. She never wanted fame or recognition or medals or elaborate ceremonies. What she wanted was simple. She wanted the pilots to survive. She wanted Allied air crews back in combat, defeating the Nazis. She wanted to live up to Edith Cavell's example of service without hatred or bitterness toward anyone. She succeeded in that goal 776 times over, and yet almost nobody knows her name today. The German officers who interrogated André after her capture in January of 1943 filed detailed reports describing their impressions of her. They said she was dangerously competent despite obvious physical limitations. They noted that she had built an extraordinarily effective organization that should not have been possible given her age and gender. They observed that she had demonstrated exceptional resilience under enhanced interrogation methods that typically break most subjects within hours. That phrase, obvious physical limitations, was Nazi code language for being female, young, and small. In their rigid ideology, women weren't supposed to be capable of running military operations. Women weren't supposed to withstand brutal interrogation. Women weren't supposed to organize complex networks spanning multiple countries. Women weren't supposed to survive concentration camps that had been specifically designed to kill people like her. André proved them wrong on absolutely every single count imaginable. She ran the most successful escape network operating anywhere in occupied Europe for 17 consecutive months. She told the Gestapo nothing useful during weeks of brutal interrogation that would have broken most trained soldiers. She survived 2 of the war's deadliest concentration camps when the camp doctors had predicted she'd die within months. She came out the other side, physically destroyed but mentally unbroken. And then she spent 35 more years helping people who desperately needed her care. Those obvious limitations the Germans saw weren't limitations at all. They were actually the world's most effective disguise. A 5-foot-tall Belgian woman walking through Nazi checkpoints with Allied pilots looked completely harmless to them. She looked like a sister or a girlfriend or a cousin, traveling with family members. When German soldiers looked at this small woman, their training, their ideology, and their entire worldview told them she couldn't possibly be a threat. They couldn't imagine she was running a network that would ultimately save hundreds of lives right under their noses. That natural camouflage kept her alive and operational for 17 months of continuous operations. It enabled 33 Pyrenees crossings. It allowed her to personally escort 118 pilots to safety. It got her through dozens of German checkpoints without incident. The Gestapo was desperately hunting for Dedée, yet they never imagined she was this tiny woman with worn shoes who walked past their patrols multiple times per week with British and American pilots in tow. When British intelligence officers at the Bilbao consulate first met André in August of 1941, their initial reports back to London were deeply skeptical of her capabilities. They wrote that she appeared too young and physically unprepared for the work she claims to be doing. They noted that her story seemed implausible given the difficult terrain and the intensive surveillance environment. Michael Creswell, the diplomat who had personally interviewed her, filed a supplemental report just 2 weeks later. This came after he had thoroughly debriefed the 3 pilots she'd delivered, after he'd taken the time to verify every detail of her story, after he'd realized she was exactly what she claimed to be, and more. His revised report stated, quote, 19 my 9 took Creswell's revised assessment very seriously. They began providing substantial support to her operations. They provided money for maintaining safe houses. They supplied false identity papers. They established secure communications channels. They provided medical supplies. They gave the Comet line everything it needed to expand its operations significantly. However, they never stopped being amazed that this entire network was being run by a 25-year-old Belgian woman who looked like a teenager and crossed the Pyrenees wearing thin-soled shoes. That amazement, that persistent underestimation of her capabilities, was actually part of why the network succeeded for so long. The Gestapo was actively hunting for a professional smuggling operation. They were looking for former military personnel. They expected to find experienced intelligence operators. They never seriously considered that Dedée might actually be a young woman who had started this network simply because she remembered stories about a nurse from World War I. The 776 Allied personnel evacuated by the Comet line included some of the RAF and USAF's most experienced air crews. These were pilots with multiple combat tours under their belts. These were bomber crews with dozens of missions. These were fighter aces with confirmed kills. These were senior officers with years of service. These were trained professionals who had seen extensive combat. Yet all of them followed André's instructions without question or hesitation. They quickly saw the precision in her planning. They recognized her competence. They realized that this small Belgian woman knew exactly what she was doing. Most importantly, they understood that their survival depended entirely on trusting her completely. Flight Lieutenant Robert Henderson, one of the 3 pilots from that very first mountain crossing, wrote about her extensively after the war ended. He said, "I had flown 42 combat missions over Germany before being shot down. I had faced enemy fighters in aerial combat. I had survived anti-aircraft flak that literally tore holes in my aircraft. But walking through German checkpoints with André was the most terrifying thing I experienced during the entire war. Not because she seemed incompetent. Quite the opposite. It was terrifying because she seemed impossibly calm about the whole thing. She would walk right up to German soldiers, smile pleasantly at them, hand over our forged papers without the slightest hesitation, and then chat with them in French like she did this every single day, which, as it turned out, she actually did. The soldiers would check our papers carefully, look at her briefly, look at us more carefully, and then simply wave us through. They never suspected for a moment that this tiny woman was running the network that was costing them hundreds of Allied prisoners. I trusted her completely with my life because it was absolutely obvious she had done this dozens of times before, and would keep doing it until the Germans finally caught her or the war ended. That dependency, the network's reliance on her leadership, should have been its greatest vulnerability. When she was finally captured, the entire network should have collapsed immediately, just like most resistance networks did when their leader was arrested. But André had built in redundancy throughout the organization. She had trained capable deputies. She had created compartmentalized cells that could operate independently. She had established clear continuation protocols for exactly this scenario. So the network actually adapted to her absence. New leaders stepped up and emerged from within the organization. Between January of 1943, when she was captured, and May of 1945, when the war ended, the Comet line successfully evacuated another 400 Allied personnel to safety. That's 400 more reasons why André's organizational genius mattered just as much as her personal courage. Strategic analysts after the war calculated the broader impact of her work. They determined that the Comet line saved approximately 12,000 hours of pilot training time. They calculated that it returned approximately 20,000 000 combat flight hours of experience back to Allied squadrons. They found that multiple squadrons were kept operational, specifically because of the pilots she returned. All of this was directly traceable to a 25-year-old Belgian nurse who remembered the story of Edith Cavell and refused to accept the limitations that others tried to impose on her based on her age and gender. And yet, despite all of this, almost nobody knows her name today. But you know her name now. If this story moved you the way it moved us while researching and writing it, then do me a favor. Hit that like button right now. Every single like you give tells YouTube's algorithm to show this story to more people who genuinely care about the heroes who have been forgotten by history. Hit the subscribe button and turn on your notifications. We're actively rescuing these stories from dusty archives and from obscurity every single week. You're not just a passive viewer sitting there. You're actively part of keeping these precious memories alive for future generations. Tell us your location in the comments. Tell us if someone in your family served during the war. Just let us know you're here and that these stories matter to you. Thank you so much for watching and for helping us honor these forgotten heroes.